When we look at indigenous communities and ask what is the most important thing in their lives, we find that what keeps a people together are the relationships that they establish and can maintain with each other. So relationship is a very key part of the development of the community, of the people, and of its need for its relationship to God. And that's, or the divine, that's what comes of the root word for religion in Latin, of religio, the link to the divine. The other point in Native ministry that's important is to understand that cultural base. Because religion is not and should not be the import to people. You know, St. Augustine knew that in England, where the Brits, the pagans there, needed to be converted, but they didn't need to become Romans. They needed to become a Church of England. And the same thing goes throughout the world. When we do not understand, when we do not want to understand, when we do not want to be beyond sensitive to the identity of the people of that land, then we lose them. Because what we implant is something very artificial.
Because I live in both cultures. I haven't given up my Hawaiianness. Sometimes we think, oh, I got to learn the language. Yeah, I'm not, one of the reasons I can't speak the language fluently, I can pick up words, but I know the cultural values, what's happening. I've seen it, I can feel it. As a Hawaiian priest, Kanaka Maoli priest, when I see people having trouble, Hawaiians, I can say that. I don't think a non-Kanaka Maoli priest can do that. And when I talk with Hawaiians, they know what I'm talking about.
One of the important key points of spiritual growth in Native peoples is health and welfare and a sense of well-being. In Hawaiian we call that pono. Without that balance, and even those English words do not formulate the totality of what it means. But without that sense of pono, without that sense of balance, without that health, relationships break apart. And when we look at what's important for Native Hawaiians, even to today, as well as in traditional culture, we find that it is the events of a person and a family or community's life that is important. When people need to have a priest or a sacred person come into their midst, they call that person there for what? For baptisms, for the first year's anniversary of a child's birth, we call it a baby luau or feast. For various occasions in the growth and journey of a person's life, they're called, and particularly in death. These are events which need the sacred. And if there are not people there who are qualified and skilled, knowledgeable about dealing with these sacred things, then why even bother? And we can see this in our present day communities when people haven't been members of the church, active members of the church, call the priests, Hawaiian priests, to come and do something. They still remember their roots, they still remember their identity, and they realize the people who can do it and they can't do it themselves. That's part and parcel of the importance of Native ministry. And in the leadership to do that ministry, we need people who are not just theologically trained, who've gone through process. We need people who understand that base culture and how to deal with it. We cannot have people who come in with a foreign culture and condemn our traditional culture and practices as being pagan, heathen. I don't believe that. I'm not going to deal with it. You are wrong, and so forth. Paul doesn't do that in the New Testament. Paul uplifts the cultures that he visits in the growing early churches, the diverse churches. And he uses their culture to show the glory of the resurrected Christ. That there is a greater message from their culture that they are missing, or that they have not heard yet, or that is exemplified by their culture, but they can't even see it.
Well, Jesus says it even much more plainly than that. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. And there's no sense of obliteration or destruction, which is what the mission did. Missionaries came to destroy and to replace. Jesus came to fulfill what was already there. That some people did not want to hear him. Well, we know what the end of that was. They nailed him to a cross because they didn't like what he was saying.
Native ministry can. As I said, you gotta, just like what we did at St. John's, you gotta be able to. You can send a priest, but you don't have to be necessarily be Hawaiian, but it helps. You have the same kind of face that I have, but sometimes you have your face more, you may look, but you don't, you're up and, you know what the key word was. You don't want to be, what's the word? Coconut. You know what a coconut is?
Brown on the outside and white on the inside.
You want to be all the same thing.
We have people who still to today see things or are visited by things that are not good, and they call upon a priest or someone who's sacred to come to deal with them because their lives are broken, their lives are disrupted. There are things that are happening that are not good. A child is sick, problems are happening, and they need help. If you come into that family thinking you know all those answers, you can do a rite or ritual out of the Book of Common Prayer and then leave, you probably won't be helping them. Because what is needed for that family is to know what is going on, what is the tensions and the problems. It is not to question whether there's a ghost there or an evil spirit or someone has cursed them or something of that nature. One needs to find the roots of the problems that deal with the relationships of those members of that family. The ritual is only part of it. But understanding their lives, becoming part of their lives, is the greater part of that healing. That's the ministry to them. And you don't get that kind of training, unfortunately, in seminary. You don't get that from reading books. You get that from being with the people and understanding that culture.
I think, I will say this, that I think it's important to have Hawaiian clergy to minister to Hawaiians, but it can also be a non-Hawaiian who knows the culture. I go back to years ago, in the plantation days, there were a lot of immigrants who came here, Chinese, Japanese, they work on the farm. They were very Hawaiian. They spoke the Hawaiian fluently because they live with Hawaiians. When you live with each other, it's a community and you feel the same way. Likewise, you feel the same way when you live with other ethnic groups. It's very important, but you cannot set yourself up as exclusive. So Hawaiian culture is important in some ways, but we have some non-Hawaiian priests, and I know some of these Hawaiian churches, when these non-Hawaiians come, they go through the whole ritual and everything else. They're part of the church. They become part of the whole system because all they ask is to have healing, to have help. And when you help in the way you know best, they will glorify God like you do.
we have to be like the children of Israel and wander for 40 years in the desert before we discover where we came from. Because they wanted to go back to Egypt. The closer they got to liberation, the more they wanted to return to what was familiar. And this is where our elders are. This is where our Polynesian peoples are. The closer we get to an understanding of what it is that makes us peculiarly Pacific people, the more we want to return to Pharaoh's household. Because it's safer. We don't have to think there. The thinking is already done for us. And so I'm constantly asking these questions of myself. And I voice them quite openly when I'm preaching among my people. Now, the younger ones want to know more. The elders go, he's not quite right, that boy. You shouldn't ask those questions. It's dangerous territory. I said, it's not dangerous, it's God's territory. What are you afraid of? The Pacific has been affected by Western thinking. And we tend to separate our cultural practices from our Christian church practices. And the language that we use in church is not the language that we use normally elsewhere. Because we've taken our language, we've turned it into a liturgical language solely for liturgical purposes. And when you read that liturgical language, you find it's actually been invented to fit liturgical purposes. A lot of the terms that you and I use in our liturgies are not our terms at all. We've translated white ideas, white phrasing, into a brown language. And fit, don't it? It just does not work. But we've got used to it. And when you suggest to elders that we can weep for our dead within the Eucharist, what? That happens out there, not in here. And when we say to our elders at home, in the service, I deliberately say, I want to consign my elders to the places that we say they are going to. So we use phrases like, haere ki te pōnui, te pōroa, te pōtangatang, te pō eawai te moe. Go to the deep night, the dark night, the long night, the night in which you will find repose and rest. Now, we've been taught that darkness is a place of evil. But in actual fact, culturally, for us, darkness is not a place of evil, it's a place of beginning. It is in the darkness of the womb that life begins. I mean, the begetting takes place and the child grows in this dark place. The child comes out of the womb, out through the vagina, and it takes itself into the world of light. Yet there's nothing dichotomous or they're not oppositional.
When we look at the needs of what indigenous people, native people require, we need to address that to understand how effective mission and ministry should be. Because what we have seen for over 400 years of the Anglican Communion in the world, and its first ministry and mission was and is to Native people. We see that after 400 years, it is still not fulfilled in any corner of the Anglican Communion. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have to look at leadership development. We have to look at spiritual growth. We have to look at what spiritual needs have been fulfilled and met. And what do I mean by that? Well, for Native Hawaiians, we've seen in this little history that I've given, one of importance of communal worship, because that harks back to the days pre-Christian of temple worship and is still within the memory and culture of the people. So liturgy is extremely important, Because liturgy expresses the theology into experience that a community has in its worship. What is also important to understand for ministry and mission to Native peoples is the deep social need of relationship. Relationship for individuals to become a family, to become a community, and then directly important to that, not separated, is the relationship of those individuals, those families and communities to the divine.
You and I have to do much more talking with each other. And in a sense, we have to work independently of our white brothers and sisters, because we have something that is particular to us, peculiar to us, and which will enrich them. Because if we did it just for ourselves, we do nothing for God. But if we took the gift and articulated it and shared it with our brothers and sisters, it makes a difference to their understanding of who they are as coexisters in the Pacific. In Hawaii, you could have the beginnings of a taro theology. I mean, how life-sustaining is the taro? How necessary was it in the travels of our people? Why did they learn to preserve it as poi? You know, they were able to utilize it in a manner that they could take it with them, and it traveled with them, and it sustained them on long journeys. Isn't that what we say about the pilgrim life in Christ? We take in the Christ into us in order to sustain us for the long journey ahead. It's what that Roman Catholic theologian called bread for the journey, taro for the journey. You see, for us, the translation of bread is taro. I would have preferred them to have, and you know why it was called taro? Because the missionaries who translated the word were affected by Samoan thinking. And they brought the word dalo from Samoa, and when they wrote when our Church Missionary Society people translated into Māori, they used the word taro rather than kumara, because of the sacred attachments to the kumara. They wanted to, if you like, expunge those ideas. So don't use the kumara image, because it was too powerful and it was a pagan image. I mean, who do these people think they are? Bread is a pagan image. I mean, it's not Christian. Because Christians eat bread and make it, doesn't necessarily make it Christian. It was a pagan thing, which Christians took over. And it is Christ, in his breaking the bread, who actually alters the understanding that we have of bread. I mean, wine is something the pagans drank. Jesus took it, shared it among his disciples and said, drink this. This is my blood. He gives it new meaning.
Well, Native Hawaiian ministry, I mean, in my growing at this time in my life as a priest of 44 years, in finding out that the most important ingredient of a group of people is to make you feel warm, loving, a community. That's so essential. In all the indigenous groups that we've been to, that I've experienced, even amongst Afro-Americans, where I worked for a few years in New York City, there has to be that warmth. To share a meal, to eat with me, to party with me. This is the kind of that brings warmth. And it brings warmth not only to indigenous people, but more so to indigenous people. It's a welcoming. It's the Hawaiian concept of ho'okipa, welcome, hospitality, come, help. And so that's crucial in ministry. When you receive, you give thanks by partaking of it. That makes the fellowship, what's the word I want? It tightens it. Pa'a, the relationship. That's hospitality. Ho'okipa is so important. Gotta have ho'okipa, more ho'okipa in the church. So when you serve communion, don't turn people away. Sometimes even have somebody, I don't think they're baptized, and they're coming to receive communion. The church, the Japanese tourist comes to the church. What am I going to tell them? Go away, you cannot take communion. This is aloha. You don't talk about aloha, it's like we talk about compassion, but what good is you talk about compassion, you have to be compassionate, You have to do this. You just don't talk about love, you have to be loving. So you have to do these kind of things. You have to put it into action. Spirituality includes both, here you imply it, loving God, but loving your neighbor as yourself. That's how compassion is. You never know how you touch a life. I don't touch the life, God touches them. If you reflect that compassionate, you reflect that love, that caring, that respect, it'll bring fruit. Maybe not now, maybe later on. But I know some of my colleague clergy wouldn't accept what I'm saying. Don't turn people away. Don't be ashamed. They come in their own ways. Welcome them.
When you say in their own ways,
well, didn't Jesus do that? Jesus, when we read in the Gospels how he dined with people. Meal is very important. When I read the scripture, he had a lot of meals with lots of people. And of course, he even sat down with the 12 people and had a meal. It was a very important thing.
So eating
was very important. Fellowship, because you take care not only of the spirit, you take care of the body. Spiritual, we talk about spirituality. It includes also that what I was talking about, compassion, and can be compassionate. That's part of the spirituality. You can't separate it. Spirituality is part of it.
What about ho'oponopono?
Ho'oponopono is coming together and to make things right.
Is that something that should be incorporated?
That should be incorporated. But people have to understand. And all of these things, you never do it for rewards. You do it with no expectations of getting anything back when you help people. It's like a Hawaiian concept when people borrow. And I watch my father, people used to borrow a lot of money. They borrow, but never a value. You never ask back. When they're ready, if they're going to give back, fine.
The Hawaiian value, Hawaiians call that kahiau.
Right.
Give without any expectation.
You give without any expectation. You don't, in a way, you always let things understand. I remember Papa was always saying, we're going to do this. He says, we'll see. It's always, we'll see. He's not like us, we got to do it here, we got to do that. He always says, we'll see. You never know what's going to happen. God will always provide, no matter what. In my own ministry, I used to tell my parish, God always provides. Don't worry. Why are you worried? God provides. Money-wise, God always takes care of you.
I find it odd that Christians, Western Christians, accuse us of worship of the dead, but they can believe in a Jesus who was crucified on a cross, buried in a tomb, and come to life again. They can believe that, but they won't accept that other people can believe that all of their ancestors can come back to visit them and they talk with them. I mean, isn't this what the communion saints is all about? It is about the dead who are a living presence in our lives. Why do we pray to the saints in the Eucharist if we don't believe that they're there in the real presence of the Christ?
And that whole place in Kulo was very sacred, because when I was young, we would go out right next to the land and we would be catching crabs in the evening. And all of a sudden we would see these spirit people you couldn't see their feet. And we felt all funny, and we would run in the house. I mean, as kids we'd say, "Oh, got ghosts out there." And the elders would say, no, you come inside, it's okay, you know. But you could feel it. So the Hawaiian thing is the feeling. Feeling is seeing. It's another way of seeing. I mean, in the Western way, we have to see with the eyes, we have to see with the mind. But in the na'au is a very important part. We can see, we can know. And so we could see these things. It's a different kind of a thing. The Spirit talks to us. How do they talk to us? Through presence, through dreams. The dead can come back. That's, after all, they're part of the family.
Every human being likes to think that they can find the beginning of existence. Whereas our Māori story says Hawaii, which is from where we come, is also the place to which we return. So the beginning is also the end. It's not much different from the Hebrew think of the Alpha and the Omega. It's exactly the same. And Hebraic thinking is, if you like, is indigenous thinking. Was it Hebrew, or did it belong to some of those nomadic tribes that they encountered in the desert? I mean, it raises all sorts of hermeneutical questions. We have a liturgy written in Māori that is in our prayer book. When they translated the Māori into English, they wrote this thing at a period when to articulate anything Māori was denigrated by the majority of the nation. Being Māori was not a good thing to do. And being Māori for us was to make a political statement, right? And so they hid a lot of the richness of the language by finding neutral phrases that sounded good to European ears. And they found this language acceptable, therefore it must be of God. And what I've done since is I've retranslated that liturgy and found in it images that I really could not get over the way these 10, 12 people sat together and created this liturgy using all the natural elements around them. They refer to human beings as the hills, as the trees that shelter us, tower over us. And they referred to them as the rocks that withstood the storms, the ravages of life. They talk of them as the tide that ebbs and flows. And that's a reference to the dead, who not only leave, but they come back again. It's okay to call them back. I mean, we have beautiful carved houses and with the most exquisite artwork. All of that artwork actually breathes a theology. Now, I wrote an article in First People's Theology Journal. I talked about looking through a stained glass window and talked about some of the carvings in that house. Now, one of the figures in the carvings, I couldn't understand why this figure was repeated throughout the house. And I asked a cousin of mine who is a carver, what do you think this carver was trying to tell us? He said, Now you look at the way the fingers are placed. He said the fingers are directly opposite each other and they're right across the center of the body. He said that person is divine. If that were a human being, the fingers would not be directly opposite each other, they'd be over and above each other. And he said, and you can tell at that point that that figure is human. But this one is then divine. But the figure that he used is an ancestor of ours called Poraurangi. Said, are you suggesting that this man is saying that the Christ belongs in our tribe? He said, well, you figure that one out for yourself. And he's probably right. You see, when we talk about indigenization of the Christ, it's actually recognition that the Christ is there. Because if you talk about indigenization, again, you're bringing someone in, right? But the reality is you're discovering what is already there from within your own culture. And all of the artwork in the place just breathes of this kind of theology. Now I went to this church for, well, I'm 66 now. For something like 60 years of my life, I've sat in that church. And I didn't realize what a theological book I was sitting in. Now the carver who carved this place carved it in the 1920s. He'd read the Bible. So what he read in the Bible, he actually carved into the house. And he got the women to make all of the craft that was in that house to match his carving. And he got them to reuse old art forms to tell a new story. It is possible to turn old wineskins into new wineskins, to transform them, which is what Jesus is saying to us. And all we have to do is have the right cultural lens to be able to read these things. The sadness of that, though, is nobody understood what the carver had done. It was his personal reflection of what he'd read. It's years after he died. He died in the 1930s. It's almost 70-something years before I discover what this man has done. But then, in discovering it, it opens up a whole new possibility for our developing a theology that is peculiarly of the Pacific. When I look at our own stories, I have to ask myself why it is that according to our popularized understanding of that creation story, all of the children, without exception, are male. And I now do a hermeneutic exercise, and I ask myself, how does it come that only men were created by both the Sky Father and Earth Mother? Where are her images? What has happened to them? And part of my task as a, if you like, as a thinker within my own indigenous world is to try and reconstruct, is to deconstruct the popularized story and reconstruct it so that you can discover just exactly what happened to the female form. Interestingly enough, I did this with a group of elders. One of them was talking about the god Tangaroa, who actually inhabits the sea. And this particular elder said, Tangaroa is a man. I said, okay. Who is the parent of the fish? And he said, Tangaroa. So I looked at the woman sitting beside him and said, are you married? Yes, I'm married to him. Ah. Do you have any children? Yes, I got grandchildren as well. Tell me, who had the children in your marriage? Him or you? She said, I did. It's not possible for men to have children. I said, but he said it is. Because he said tangaroa is a male. And tangaroa is the parent of the fish. How can this be? It started a debate among them. And we started to look through our mythology, and we discovered a few other women that had been hidden. And where did they hide? They hid themselves in their mother. In one of the brothers, who turned himself upside down, he put his head into the earth, and he pushed with his feet to separate both Sky Father and Earth Mother. And in order to sever the sinews that bound those two together, the god of aggression and war went around and he slashed the sinews, which caused them to bleed, both parents to bleed. And the redness you see in the sky is, if you like, is the symbol of the blood that those two still shed between them over their separation. And of course, all the female children decided that these brothers were too much for them, so they hid themselves in the mother. And one of the females decided she did not want to be born. And she still remains the fetus inside the mother, and she is the mother of the earthquakes. And when she wants to remind her brothers of the awful thing they did to their parents, she shakes the earth. She gives them poor cause to think. Also in the earth was the parent of the sweet potato, or the kumara. Now the kumara for us is a symbol of peace, of good fortune, and good life. As long as you have kumara, you know your family will continue to exist. But growing the kumara is a very exact science. You have to know the phases of the moon, the tides. You have to know the month at which you plant the seed, at which you take off the shoot and transplant it into the field. And you have to follow the phases of the moon to know when you harvest that kumara. And then you have to store it for the winter. So you have to learn how to build a house in which you could store this kumara. So I said, now, if the kumara is another creation of one of these children, do you think it was a male that gave birth to the kumara? And everyone in the room except the men said, nah, it had to be a woman. Now, all of the things that nurture humanity are all female. I find myself at loggerheads with a whole lot of other people who continue to claim that these are male. And I point out to them that the stories were recorded by people who were trained by English missionaries, who were the epitome of the patriarchy that existed in Victorian times. So they heard the stories and they wrote them down. And when they used a term that was used for those children, they called them ngā tama arangi. Tama actually does not mean male, it actually means child. But we recognized it and said, this is a male word. It's not that at all. And tamariki, which is about children, is the child of the gods. So every child that is born is a child of the gods. I mean, all of this has a rich theology within it. And we have to be able to retell the story and understand the theology that is there. We have to liberate that mythology from the shackles of colonization, of westernization, and set it free.
So in its totality, there is a place for Native ministry. And there is a place that Native ministry can teach the rest of this church how to do a 21st century mission work that was not done right and appropriately back in the 19th century, in the 18th century, when it all began in Jamestown, in Virginia, in the United States. Or at that time, not even the United States. It has to change, and by addressing the indigenous population, which the communion should have addressed and failed in doing so, we can understand what is being said by the evangelists when they say to us that each of us can help us in our journey wandering in the desert. When we learn these things, we share them with each other, so that by the time we reach the gates of the New Jerusalem, we are ready to become one people, one church, one faith. Because John the Evangelist says in the New Testament, they will come as 12 to the 12 gates, not one to the one gate. In other words, we will be bringing with us our own personal tribal people's journey. And we will be able to share that with each other, and we will become new. We only become new through Christ in the New Jerusalem. It is not here. So this idea of personal salvation, that I will get there before you do, doesn't work. I can get to the gates before you do, maybe because I have that aha moment. But I won't be allowed in until you get there. So what's the rush and the hurry if we cannot bring our own brothers and sisters with us? And the empowerment of Native ministry is to take what Jesus calls the least of my people, to uplift them so that they can uplift all of us. When I worked in the Department of Health, we had an adage which was, if we can help the worst of the worst in this state to become healthy, we will have helped everyone else. How does that work? In the same way that I'm saying about what Jesus says when he says of the shepherd who divides the goats and the sheep. And he talks about the categories of the worst, the prisoners, the hungry, the needy. And he says, if you have done anything to them, you have done it to me. And somebody asks, well, when did we ever do this to you? He said, well, if you've done it to any of them, you have done it to me. And when we look at the statistics for indigenous people around the world, they are in that heap. So if we look at a ministry that can empower Native peoples, that can give them that self-reliance, the hope, the identity to do their ministry will affect everyone else in this church.
We're in St. Andrew's Cathedral, the King and Queen's Church, and we hope there'll be a lot of warmth in this church for Hawaiians.
Hey, we got a lot of work to do to each other. But first of all, you and I as Pacific brothers and sisters, we've got to talk to each other and tease out our own culture and delve, if you like, the depths of that culture and draw together all the strands of theology that already exist. We got a task.
Yeah.